Okay. I'm waiting for your person to introduce you. Ready to go? All right. There you go.
Really? I don't have to go to the podium?
Well,
That's even
you
better.
might want people to see.
Oh. Okay. Good evening, everybody. What a fantastic turnout we have tonight. How many of you, is this your first time at a museum after hours? Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you for being here tonight. A couple of things. My name is Susan Mahoney. I'm the Director of Operations with the Kansas Historical Foundation. We are the private side, and we exist solely to help raise money to support the activities of the Society, to which we have several staff people here tonight, some of our department chairs, and just excellent people. So if you work for the Kansas Historical Society, can you please stand up and be recognized? Thank you, everybody. They do amazing work, and it's a pleasure to be able to do things like tonight, and your donations and your memberships help support the activities and the things that they need to do, whether it's in the archives, whether it's in archaeology, whether it's in education or in the gallery. So thank you. With that, Director Mary had the opportunity to go see her grandbaby this week, so she is not here with us tonight. I don't know why a little chubby boy with big chunky cheeks would take over this, but in her place we have Curator Blair.
Thank you, Susan. I do think it was because, first of all, Mary needs to get another 10,000 photographs of her baby to her grandson, show the staff. The first 90,000 weren't enough. If she ever does a program here on her grandson, it's going to be 12 hours, believe me. I do think, though, she had another reason for not being here tonight. As you know, we had to cancel last month because of the weather. We had the problem of a changing weather report about every hour, plus the speaker was a little leery about coming over from Kansas City. So we apologize because we know a number of you still came out. Thank you. I will tell you that we have rescheduled Adrian Zink for July. I'm looking, they got a laugh, I'm not sure why. Yes. We'll do a little other housekeeping too. Reminder of next month's talk on March 8th. That will be another wonderful speaker from the Army Command and General Staff College, John Kuhn, who will be speaking on the naval war in Vietnam. And I do want to mention, and I'm sorry I forgot to look up what the talk is tomorrow. There is the annual Bleeding Kansas series at Constitution Hall State Historic Site. That is, I said tomorrow, it's actually Sunday. I know it's border war. Well, most of the talks are border war. Any case, that's at, I'm forgetting here, 2 o'clock Sunday at Constitution Hall. And if anybody thinks that's wrong, please tell me now. Reminder that that series continues for the next 3 Sundays at Constitution Hall. I will also alert you to the next special exhibit that is coming up here at the museum. That will open on March 1st, and it is the title 105 Counties, 105 Stories. We have assembled 105 stories from each county, which is quite an ordeal, actually, for those who have ever tried it. find out one special story from each county. It should be a very interesting exhibit. We think it will be a very interesting exhibit, and we encourage you to come out and see it. It will be up for about a year. Finally, that gets us to our speaker. And I'm happy to say this is a return appearance for him. He spoke back in November of 2017 on the Great War in the Air. And tonight we move up in time a little bit to the B-29s and the Battle of Kansas. John Curatola is another member. I'm sorry if this thing is cutting out on me. I always have trouble with this microphone. But John Curatola is one of the many staff members at the Command and General Staff College up at Fort Leavenworth. He is another one of their excellent speakers. We can't say enough about getting these people down from Fort Leavenworth to talk, because they have given us many wonderful talks. And without further ado, here's John Curatola.
Thank you, sir. First of all, thanks for coming out on a Friday night. Look, I'm surprised that people don't have better things to do than listen to an aviation historian geek out and talk about airplanes, okay? This is what I do for a living, and it's nice when your hobby is your job, okay? So I got both things going on. Okay? I'm a retired Marine officer who works for the Army that studies the Air Force, so I'm kind of schizophrenic in that regard. But I have great respect and admiration for the men and the air crews who serviced, flew, and went into combat in these airframes. To me, what they did on a daily basis is certainly worthy of respect, and it's one of the reasons why I got interested in this topic as a scholar, and I found that their history is quite captivating. And I was told just as I was coming in today, they would actually have two B-29 crewmen amongst us right now. The first is John Plum. Would you please stand up in the back so we can recognize you?
He's over here.
There he is. There he is. Yeah. Not combat. And we also have Mr. Jim Marshall here, who flew combat missions over the Pacific. And I will tell them at any time in tonight's presentation, if you want to stop and say you're wrong, you have carte blanche, gentlemen. This is your area, okay? Okay. With that, let me go ahead and start off here and talk about, okay, technical problems. But that'd be a problem for a lesser instructor. Okay, let's first do a strategic framework. What's going on? Why are we doing this thing called strategic bombing? What's the point behind it? And the idea here is, after the First World War, where you have 11 million men killed in trenches, in mud, in barbed wire, getting stuck, let's avoid that. Maybe if we go after an enemy's infrastructure and their ability to produce sinews of war, because now armies are bigger and they're mechanical and they're reflective of the mechanized societies that create them. So instead of fighting on the front, what if we go deep? What if we go long and go after the economies, go after their factories, go after their infrastructure? That way, we can have war that'll be much less bloody. Yes, we'll kill some civilians, we know that, but I'd rather kill maybe 250,000 civilians as opposed to 11 million men. So this is kind of the idea in the interwar years. And the U.S. Army Air Corps, which becomes the Army Air Force, which then becomes the United States Air Force, has these tenets of strategic bombing, and they're largely based upon this idea of precision daylight bombing. Okay? We're going to go bomb factories. We don't bomb populations per se. We'll kill some civilians, but that's not the target. Okay? Our targets are largely the population centers and the production centers. No? Okay, I'll just do it manually. No big deal. One of the machines that we devised to do this is, of course, the B-29. Now, the B-29 is the single biggest expense of the Second World War. Anybody know what the second biggest expense was? Manhattan Project. Manhattan Project cost us $2 billion. This thing, $3 billion. okay? At the time, it was the most complex aircraft ever built by the United States, and I'll talk about this a little bit more. Almost 4,000 of them are built, and it requires a significant amount of U.S. aviation industrial capacity just to produce these things, okay? So, with that in mind, put this in the back of your head. We're going to spend $3 billion on this thing, and it's going to take a lot of industry manpower and resources to do this. And the main advocate behind this aircraft is, of course, the Chief of Staff of the Army Air Forces, General Hap Arnold. Now, Hap's a hard guy to work for, okay? He's a taskmaster. Here's the deal. It's gonna work. Do you understand me? Okay, with that as our premise, it's gonna work. Got it? Thank you. Thank you, sir. No problem. Let me go back here. Okay. First flights in September 21st, 1942. This was bought as a paper airplane. What the hell does that mean? What that means is there was a design on the drawing board, and the Air Force said, we'll buy it. Hadn't even built the darn thing yet. We bought it off of a design, just off of paper. Okay? And like any new piece of equipment, it's got problems. Okay? But this aircraft, like I said, is a significant leap in aviation technology. And what we think was going to happen is if Great Britain was to fall during the Battle of Britain, and our B-17s that were supposed to fly from England over to Germany to bomb it, if we lost that base, how do we range Germany now? Enter what they called the Very Long-Range Bomber, or the VLR, the B-29. And the idea was to fly these out of bases in Turkey, all the way over the Dalmatian Islands and up into Europe proper. Okay. Well, of course, we know England doesn't fall, and so the B-29 isn't used in the European theater by and large. It's only used during the war in the Pacific theater, not in the European theater. Okay. As this aircraft was being designed, they used what's called a concurrent planning, meaning they were designing the engines, the airframes, the electrical system, the pneumatic system, all simultaneously, not sequentially. So you can imagine the amount of disconnects you might have. For those of you who are engineers who would understand, this can lead to all kinds of problems. Now, the B-29, as I said, is a significant increase in aviation technology. And you can compare it here to the existing B-17, which is a 1930s design, compared to the B-29, which of course is a 1940s design. And you can see the horsepower is significantly different, and the size of the airframe is significantly different. Also, the B-29 can carry the B-29 has about twice the weight and power of a B-17. It's got more of a streamlined design. I'll give you some numbers here. Excuse me, I've gone old and gray in the service of my country. The B-29 can go up to 358 miles an hour. That's red line speed. Is that correct, sir? Correct me if I'm wrong. Okay, all right. Whereas your B-17 can go about 287, your B-24 about 300. B-17 gets you about 2,000 miles. This thing, of course, can get you about 3,250. The bomb load of a B-17 is 6 tons. This thing has a bomb load of 10 tons. So again, it is a significant increase in aviation capability, and of course, this is with a crew of 10. When they were designing the aircraft, they had to give it a name. And because this thing at the time carried so much bomb load compared to a B-17, one of the names proposed was the Annihilator. But they did away with it and called it the Superfortress. Okay. Now, I talked about the fact that this thing was an aviation technological marvel. One of the things this thing does in 1942 that's new, it has flush riveting. Instead of having regular rivets, you all seen a rivet, well, that produces parasitic drag on an aircraft, and it makes it go slower. The B-29 had flush rivets in it, so it was more streamlined. And next time you're at the bar and somebody wants to make a bet of how many rivets are in a B-29, it's over 1 million. There you go. So impress your friends at the bar with that one. Okay? The sheets of metal that composed the aircraft's airframe were all butt jointed, meaning they weren't overlapping. They were next to each other. You can imagine the tolerances and exact measurements you have to have an airframe that is pressurized, by the way. This is one of the first pressurized combat aircraft that actually butts up skin to skin, not overlaps. That is also new. But one of her most complex elements was her engines. The R3350 engines had about 2,000 horsepower. It was a brand new design, but it had a tendency to overheat. And in the initial models, the crew would say they could only taxi for about 10 minutes before the engines would overheat. I'm sure it didn't change much over the years either. Okay. This tends to be a problem too when you're flying in the sky. The exhaust valves tend to get swallowed up into the cylinder heads, which of course would cause the engine to catch on fire. And the problem with that was once the engine catches on fire, the crankcase for the engine is made out of magnesium. Magnesium burns at a very high temperature. I don't know what it is, sir, you probably do, but it drives very high. They had fire extinguisher systems on the B-29. The problem is the fire extinguisher system couldn't deal with the heat of the magnesium fire. So if the fire burned through the firewall of the engine, the fuel tanks are sitting behind it, so you know the rest of that story. They had a problem with the pneumatic propellers on the aircraft. If an aircraft engine like these gets hit or is damaged or you need to shut it down, the propeller blade is what we call feathered, where you turn it parallel to the slipstream. So it doesn't create drag and it doesn't spin. You don't want it to spin because there's no oil going to the crankcase anymore. And if it does spin, what happens to something metal that is rotating that is not lubricated? It gets hot. And then what will happen is it will get so hot that it will fuse and it will get stuck. But the wind is still pushing the propeller and it would yank the entire engine out of the wing root. And of course, once you have that, you have catastrophic failure. Okay. The B-29 needed some 40,000 different parts, not including bolts or duplicates, and it required 20% of Boeing's workforce to just be riveters to make this thing. Now, that's just for Boeing. You also had a number of subcontractors to include GM, which made the props, AC Spark Plugs made the autopilot system, GE, General Electric, made the fire control system, and Chrysler, Goodyear, Republic Aviation, up to another 140 subcontractors helped produce this aircraft. It wasn't just one company. Okay. And again, these things are happening concurrently at the same time. So again, you're going to have some disconnects. Why are we building these things at Boeing Wichita? Okay, lots of good reasons. One, you got a lot of space. You got a skilled labor pool here. What preceded World War II was, of course, the Great Depression. And there's a lot of people that are out of work. And you're in the middle of the country, and wages in the middle of the country are substantially less than what they are on the coasts. So you got a cheap labor force and lots of out-of-work farmers who are good with their hands. Makes sense. Also, we're in a war. And you don't want to have your major industrial capacities next to a coast because we don't know what the Germans or Japanese are going to do. So here you're nicely safe tucked in the middle of the United States. Okay? Also, you have railroads that come in here, and where do most of your materials and resources come to build these aircraft? They come in via railroad, and there's an 8-spoke railroad hub in Topeka, or Wichita, excuse me, at this time. And if I may notice I put this in big words and in italicized, relatively good weather for training and building these things. Okay, relatively good weather, and of course what happened here the past couple of days, you can call me a liar all you want. Okay. They also had B-29 factories in Seattle, Omaha, and Marietta, Georgia. Most of them were built here in Wichita. Of the 1,769 B-29s that were made here in Wichita, that composed 44% of all B-29 production. 44% were made here in Kansas, okay? And one of the things, too, about Wichita plant is that it gets more and more efficient making B-29s as time goes on. The first 100 B-29s required 157,000 worker hours. The second 100 required 78,000. The third 100 required 57,000 hours, and they were down to about 30,000 hours eventually during the final run. So they get more and more efficient making these aircraft as time goes on. By the end of 1944, they are making 4 B-29s per day. 4. And here's some pictures of the factory that you can see. Now, building an aircraft is somewhat different. You can't just make an assembly line like you do in cars. The parts are too big, the tolerances are too small, the dimensions are too large, and as I said, aircraft manufacturing requires a finer touch. Okay? They had a multi-line system established, one just for the nose, one for, you can see here in the bottom right, one for the forward fuselage, one for the center section, the tail, the central wing, and the outer wing. These 6 lines fed into 2 or 3 final assembly lines. And so basically what happened is it came put together in chunks and then assembled and then put forward, as opposed to just a regular production line like you see a car. Okay? And again, this requires a lot of space. Okay, the prototype is, they built 2 prototypes in 1940. They order it and they expand the Wichita plant, and of course test pilot Eddie Allen is killed with one of the new prototype aircraft. The engine catches on fire and he crashes. And the first production model here is built in 1943. Note that 250 of these B-29s were ordered before the ex-B-29, which is the one that Eddie Allen was in and he crashed in. Okay. The fire itself is a pretty large event. There's a congressional investigation that gets put in, headed by no other than Harry Truman. And the modification list for the B-29 to make it a safer, better airframe is going to grow and continue to grow. And at one time, it's up to some 1,500 change orders per design for this aircraft. And again, go back to the concurrent nature of the design process. Now, let's go back up to the strategic realm here in the war. When the Japanese invade Manchuria, they occupy it and they sit still for a few years. And then in 1937, they invade China proper. Okay? And China becomes our ally against the Japanese, of course, after Pearl Harbor. And FDR is very interested in getting the Chinese and the Americans involved in the war. We see them as an important ally to defeat the Japanese offensive juggernaut. So what he wants to do is get them involved by sending over B-29s into what we call the China-Burma India Theater, or the CBI. And we're going to send these bombers over there, and we're going to bomb Japan from China. This is going to be the first operational use of these things. Okay? March 5th, 1943, his 10th or 20th Bomber Command is directed to fly its first mission in April or May. Now, we're not even close to producing these things yet in number. Okay? By March 9th, 1943, Hap Arnold shows up in Wichita to see how many he has ready to leave and depart for China. And you can see on the slide already, none already. Imagine that. Here comes your boss. Hey, how many B-29s? We got 175 you want to send over. How many do you have ready? None. Now remember, go back to what I said before. It's gonna work. So Hap's not too pleased. So what he says is, we're going to get this done, and he's going to order an all-out effort to finish and modify 175 B-29s in 4 weeks. Now go back to the mechanical problems that I told you about. And here's where the Battle of Kansas starts to form. By tax day, right, April 15th, you got to swap out 22 rudders, 144 main landing gears tire to replace, 104 cowl flaps, installation of a new radar, 100 propeller pistons have to be modified, and change 116 engines, 24 turbochargers. Each engine requires at least 12 hours, and each engine change requires 4 to 6 hours of run-up time. And you got to do this in a matter of weeks. And what time of year is it? It's winter. And I asked for the weather yesterday to kind of emphasize the point here, that most of the mechanics that are doing this work are doing it at outlying fields. They're doing it outside because there's no hangars. During this period, 23 inches of snow fell in Kansas that year, and the wind was at an average of 15 miles an hour per day. Most of the ground crew were living in tar paper shacks at these outlying fields, making these modifications. They had to establish heating tents for these gentlemen to go in and just warm up, because they're doing all of these modifications outside. Some of them, the lucky ones, had heated suits and gloves. And you can imagine doing this in an outlying field with an austere amount of gear, i.e. not a lot of ladders and cranes and jacks and those kinds of things. One of the biggest problems they had was the rudder changes. They had to make 22 rudder changes. Now, you can see how big a B-29 is. Here's the rudder. 15-mile-an-hour winds, and you got to hang this rudder on the tail of a B-29. You're manhandling it. This is what's called the Battle of Kansas, because it's these individual men working 10-hour shifts, 7 days a week, with every other weekend off. Wichita actually puts workers on 21 consecutive 10-hour days. They will bring in 600 more workers just to do this particular effort. And remember, with the concurrent nature of the planning, they're modifying the aircraft. At the same time, they're getting change orders for the aircraft. So when they think they may have the modification done, oh, we got more mods. That plane's not quite ready yet. And because the engines at this time were so unreliable, they had to give every bomber that left a spare engine. And they put it in the bomb bay, so when it left, it had 5 engines. 4 running and 1 in the bomb bay to take it just in case, to swap it out. Many of the tires that they had to change were pulled by hand. You need to change a car tire. Can you imagine changing a tire on a B-29? Okay. The biggest problem, of course, was the engine change, because they had a version of the engine that worked. However, they wanted better combat performance, and there was a new modification to the engine which required the entire engine to be changed, which required the removal of all the lines, the engine hoisted, mounting brackets removed, then swung out, the same steps for installation, and change the turbochargers out too. Okay. So any of you who've changed the engine in your car, you know what I'm talking about, how difficult this system was. Okay. On March 26, 1944, the first modified B-29 departs Smoky Hill out of Salina, Kansas for Asia. And by June 5th, 1944, there's the first bombing mission of the B-29s over Bangkok, Thailand. Bangkok is the first use of the B-29s. And what they're finding out is it's not that good of an airplane. Okay? We'll talk about that here in a little bit. Once they get to China, the planes that they have modified in what's called Operation Matterhorn, they're going to fly out of bases in central China and bomb Japanese production facilities in the southern part of the main islands, Honshu and Kyushu. Okay? And in order to make airfields, they literally rely on coolie labor. Thousands and thousands of Chinese peasants taking big rocks, making them into small rocks, leveling it out to make the airfield for these planes to take off and land. Sorry about that. Now, interesting, in reading some of the letters from the air crewmen who flew in the China-Burma-India theater, the plane is so bad that the crewmen don't talk about flying in combat. What they talk about is the fact that we got off the ground. because of the nature of the environment they're flying in. It's very humid, it's very hot. So what happens is the engines aren't producing the horsepower needed to lift 10 tons off the ground worth of payload. And a lot of these planes are crashing on takeoff. A lot of the engines are overheating while they're at altitude. And they're having about a quarter of the raids that they are launching out of China return. So you got a 25% basic abort rate. This is not an efficient use of air power. This is a mess. Plus, in order to fly out of China, you have to bring all your logistics with you, because there's no land road here. Everything that the air crews need to fly out of Chengdu must be flown into Chengdu. That means bombs and fuel. You have to stockpile it. Once you have enough, then you can launch a raid. And in some cases, when the weather is bad, the aircraft that was delivering fuel takes more fuel home than what it actually brought. Okay? Now, they're flying these missions about 1,500 miles. Remember, it's got about a 3,000-mile range, so 1,500 miles there and then 1,500 miles back. And you can see they're hitting some of the targets in the southern half of Japan. But again, this is a logistical nightmare, and it's not working out real well. And as a matter of fact, Hap Arnold realizes what's happening, and he fires two of the commanders there of the 20th Bomber Command. And he puts in charge a guy who everybody in here has probably heard of, Kurt LeMay. Curtis LeMay is a rising star, no pun intended. Yes, he's a general officer, okay. Bum, tip your waitresses, folks. Okay, he's a rising star. And when he gets to China, he realizes he doesn't have the ground crewmen who know how to fix the engines. He doesn't have the logistics package he needs to support this effort. The distances, the weather, the conditions, this is not working. And he's the only guy who can tell Hap Arnold, no. Stop this. This is a waste of effort. And he's the only guy who can do it, because he has the gravitas now as a operational commander. He can tell Hap no. So what happens is, by this time the Marines, you're welcome, take the Marianas Islands, okay, with some Army help. I got that. We fired an Army guy, but that's beside the point, okay? We're not, sorry about that. The Marines take the Marianas Islands, and now, instead of flying out of China and that whole logistical line that you had that was problematic, you can fly out of Guam, Tinian, and Saipan. Some 1,500 miles over the ocean. You can stockpile supplies because the Navy can bring it to you and dump it out on the shoreline there. You can build fuel farms and bomb dumps and have stockpiles of stuff, and huge airfields made with tractors and have asphalt and all those things that go part and parcel with modern air power. And it is from here where the B-29s will really make their point, will really do their emphasis in terms of strategic bombing. Oops, go back. But again, flying out of the Marianas has its own problems. We talked about the engine and airframe issues and the aircraft performance, but something else happens on the way to Tokyo. Ba-bum, bum. I'm flying at 20, 30,000 feet. And my airspeed says I'm going 250 knots, but my ground track is maybe 100 knots. What's happening? The jet stream, that's right. And what's happening is these guys are chugging along 4 or 5 hours. They're supposed to be halfway to the target. They're not even close. This is where the Air Force starts to realize the jet stream is pushing against them. Okay? Another problem you have with weather, and my dad was a meteorologist, so I can talk about meteorologists all I want. Okay. Not only is the jet stream a problem, clouds are a problem. You have summer and winter weather patterns between the Marianas and Japan proper. And what happens in the wintertime is that cold air comes down from Siberia, mixes with the warm Pacific air, and you have these towering cumulonimbus fronts that go up to 20, 30,000 feet on top of the jet stream. And so, sir, when you were flying formations, weather was usually an issue, whether you were going to Japan or once you got to Japan. Because in the summer months, it reversed. And the weather formations were now over the Japanese main islands. So it's kind of one of those things where you can't win for losing, okay? Now, one of the things that we find out, or that LeMay finds out, is with this problem he has regarding the airframe. It doesn't like to fly at high altitude, which it was designed to do, okay? It was supposed to fly long distances, which it's having a problem doing because of the jet stream. And he starts thinking, what if, instead of flying at 20,000, 30,000 feet, what if I only went up to 10 or 15,000 feet? Now, these are air-cooled engines, not liquid-cooled. And of course, those of you who know about engines, air-cooled engines like air. And at 20 or 30,000 feet, the air is rarefied. And the engines are going to run hotter because there's less molecules going over the cooling fins. Okay? Science 101. Okay. Now, if I fly at lower altitudes, more particles of air going over my engine and it's cooling it. Hey, that might be a good idea. Something else. If I'm flying up to 20 to 30,000 feet, that means my engines have to be on max power or at a high RPM for a longer period of time to get up to altitude, which also adds to stress of my engine. What if I just flew lower in the cooler air and I didn't use as much power and fuel and oil climbing up to altitude? And, oh, by the way, instead of flying through the cumulus nimbus clouds, I'll take a bet and I'll fly underneath them. Yes, I'll get rained on. I know it's a bad place to be, but at least I'm beating the jet stream. My engines are running cooler, and I'm avoiding the towering front. This might work. Something else that LeMay is going to realize. The Japanese, unlike the Germans, don't have large infrastructure in terms of factories. They don't have these big industrial parks and these big plants like the Germans do. What the Japanese have done at this time, what the American thinking is, and I'll talk about this in a little bit later, is that they have cottage industries. Mom and pop shops that have lathes or machine tools in them that actually make cylinder heads or gaskets or hoovulator valve parts. I made that up, okay? And what they do is they collect these parts up and take them to an assembly factory, and there they assembled the Japanese bomber or the fighter. So what that means is, to get to their means of production, I need to hit homes, not factories. Now, go back to where I started with the American idea of precision daylight bombing. We don't kill civilians, we hit factories and infrastructure. What if that is one and the same? The factories are these homes where people live. And something else we know about Japanese cities. Unlike in Europe, where they're made out of bricks and masonry, in the Pacific, they're made out of wood and paper. And we know from the Japanese earthquake in 1923, these cities will light up relatively easy with fire, and it will spread. LeMay puts these things together, and he comes up with the idea of low-level bombing. And instead of doing precision bombing from 30,000 feet, I'll do area bombing from 10,000, 15,000 feet. I'm not interested of hitting just a factory. I want to hit this particular area of a Japanese city. And it makes life a little bit easier for his air crewmen. Okay? So what you're seeing here, this is the ironic thing here, is that the technology now is driving the application. It's changing the doctrine of how we see strategic bombing unfolding in the Pacific in 1945. Okay? This is significant. It's the tail wagging the dog now. Now remember, go back to Hap Arnold. What do you say about the B-29? It's gonna work. LeMay doesn't tell Hap Arnold what he's going to do. He does it all by himself. And on March 9 and 10, 1945, he tells his ground crewmen and his air crewmen, take out all the machine guns out of the airplanes. Oh, and all those bullets and rounds, take those out too. You're not going to need them. Because we're going to find that sweet spot between the Japanese low-level anti-aircraft defense and their high-level anti-aircraft defense, and we're going to fly in the middle. And the Japanese don't have a defense for that, and that's where we're going to fly. Now imagine yourself being Jim here going, you mean I can't shoot back? I don't have any guns on me? You got to be freaking kidding me, boss. LeMay relents and he says, I'll give you the tail gunner back. You can have the tail gunner. And that's what he does. So on the evening of March 9th, he launches what's called Operation Meeting House. Let me go back. Okay. And these guys are going to fly at night to Tokyo, and they're going to bomb a large portion of the city itself. I'll give you some numbers here. They took off at 5:30, and 325 B-29s dropped 1,665 tons of incendiaries on a target that was 3 miles by 4 miles, which had about 750,000 workers. At 12 a.m., Japanese time, Tokyo time, the Pathfinders, the planes that go in early on the strike, mark the target with a giant X with incendiary bombs. Following that, the bombers come in at a staggered formation from 5,000 to 9,000 feet. And then as the flames get worse, they'll start to increase their altitudes. A firestorm with these incendiaries that are dropped ensues within 30 minutes. Carbon monoxide level gets toxic. Temperatures reach 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. The canals and ponds boil, glass liquefies, and the glow is seen from some 150 miles away. 10 B-29s will go down because of the heat, the superheated drafts coming up will flip B-29s over or break their wing spars because it's so violent. One B-29 actually does a barrel roll and makes it back. Planes were trashed after that, but the pilot actually got it back. To see a plane with a 103-foot wingspan do that is amazing.
16 square miles are burned.
Yes, sir. And I will tell you, in this one raid, the United States will kill over 85,000 Japanese men, women, and children in one night. Single biggest loss of life in a bombing raid of the war. Bigger than the atomic blast, not the subsequent atomic radiation and injuries you get as a result of atomic radiation. I'm only talking about the blast effect. This is the biggest loss of life for the Axis in terms of strategic bombing. And this also becomes an issue when the question comes up about the atomic bomb. Because by the time August 1945 rolls around, we're going to be doing this day and night over the Japanese islands. Here's Osaka. The red areas highlight the burnt areas of Japanese urban infrastructure that is burnt out. Over 100 square miles of Japanese urban infrastructure will be completely eradicated as a result of the firebombing raids over Japan. Give you some more numbers here. Here you go. This will help put it in perspective for you. Now, when it comes to the decision of the atomic bomb, there's a lot of issues about should we, what's the, is this moral? And one of the issues that comes up is, what's the difference? Whether the ignition is fission, i.e. atomic fission, splitting the atom, or a regular incendiary fire. What difference does it make in terms of its total effect? And many people will go, yeah, what's the difference? Doesn't matter because we've been doing this already. And you can see these are just equivalent percentages of how much Japanese urban infrastructure is burnt as a result. Okay. When LeMay launches these bombers on that March 9 and 10 raid. He can't fly combat missions. He's a general officer now, and he's prohibited from flying in combat. He flies one just so he can say he did it, and he gets in the Pacific, to see what the crews are up against. And he's listening to his radio as the mission commander is over Tokyo, and he's waiting to hear the report. And remember, he didn't tell anybody he was doing this. He gambled his crews and his aircraft and his entire command on his singular decision. And in his memoirs, he writes, "That night, waiting for the report, I had anxiety I did not wish to ever experience again." After he gets the results back, he wires Hap Arnold of this raid. And Hap Arnold sends him a congratulatory message. And I'll quote it to you. It says, "Congratulations on your fine result. This proves that you and your men have the guts to do anything. Keep up the good work." Now, in 1945, did you care about the Japanese infrastructure, men, women, and children? Hell no. We're in a war, and we know what the Japanese did. So you think of this in terms of context, this is a big hit. This is celebrated within the United States, okay? And LeMay will get fan mail, and people will ask for his autograph and postcards and those kinds of things. I read one letter from an Army chaplain saying, "You're really giving the Japs hell, General. Keep up the good work." Okay? So again, look at the stuff contextually. This is not necessarily a bad thing if you're there in the spring of 1945 and your brother, your uncle, your cousin, this gentleman here, is in harm's way. Okay? I talked about the differences between the firebombing raid and the atomic raid. You can see here, yellow is Nagasaki, the pink is Hiroshima, and the red is the Tokyo raid of March 9 and 10, the initial deaths and the people injured. Again, I'm not talking about radiation deaths subsequent. Obviously, then it pales in comparison. But just for the initial blast. In total, about 2.3 million homes will be burned, over 1 million injured, anywhere between 300 to 900,000 Japanese will be killed, but we really don't know what that total is because they didn't keep that good of records. Okay. And here's what LeMay says about it. If you can't read it from the back, it says, "Killing Japanese didn't bother me very much at the time. I suppose if it had and lost the war, I would have been tried as a war criminal. Every soldier thinks something of the moral aspects of what he is doing, but all war is immoral, and if you let that bother you, you're not a good soldier." This picture that you see of LeMay here, that's in the front, comes from the front cover of Time magazine in 1945. And the subscript underneath, where you can't read it, says, "Can Japan stand twice the bombing that Germany got?" Okay. Again, he's celebrated at this. Now, don't tell Time magazine I use this because they would charge me for it. Okay, bad thing. All right. And a lot of this victory in terms of the strategic bombing campaign begins right here. I know I painted kind of a dark picture in the execution, but you can't separate the two. These things are connected. But the idea of strategic bombardment over long range finds its nexus here in the Pacific. It flowers much more than it does in the European theater because it completely ravages the Japanese infrastructure. It ravages their urban infrastructure, their production capacities. And then when you drop 2 atomic bombs on top of it, if you're a true blue air power believer, we won the war. If you're an Air Force officer, an Army Air Force, you won the war. This is what did it. And in 1946, we'll have what's called the United States Strategic Bombing Survey will come out. And it is a painstakingly reviewed analysis of the strategic bombing campaign, both in Europe and in the Pacific. And here's where it gets really interesting. The bombing survey says, yeah, kinda. It kinda worked. Now, if you're a true blue Air Force believer, you're lying. This is fake news back before fake news became fake news, okay? And for those who are not true believers of strategic bombing, the game's changed now, because now one plane with one bomb can have the same effect as many planes with repeated raids over Japanese cities, i.e., the advent of atomic technology now has changed the game. The B-29s that were made in Nagasaki and Hiroshima are specially equipped, called silver plate bombers, that had more horsepower, pneumatic actuators for the door, didn't have any defensive armament except for the tail gunners, and those were made up in Omaha, up in Building D. But the idea here is that now atomic weapons are the way of war, and you armies and the navies and you Marine Corps guys, you're cute. The Air Force now is the future of warfare. This is how wars are going to be fought in the future. This is what comes out of the Second World War and what comes out of the combined bomber offensive. And with that, I will open the floor for any questions you may have. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I grew up in Topeka.
Yes, sir.
I saw the 29s coming in and out of the war there in 44, 45, and I saw the Enola Gay Space
Air and Space Museum.
and there's a window over the hangar where the Enola Gay was prepared to go to the Pacific.
Mm-hmm.
And the question now is, we talk about a 4 to 6 hour run-up or something like that,
To
heat up or something on the plane before they flew.
Your first engine run.
when they swap the engines out, you have to test the engine, and they would have to run it for 4 to 6 hours on a ground test before it was certified to be airworthy in the aircraft itself. That's what we're talking about.
What I remember moving about, once they started those engines, the big clouds of black smoke.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, there's a whole story behind the development of the engine, which will really bore the crap out of anybody in here. But part of it is that one of the errors they have is that the machines they're using to help craft the machines are out of tolerance. Yeah, and you can imagine the ripple effect if your calibration's not correct and you're machining metal parts like exhaust valves and those kinds of things. That's one of the problems that they have, is that they don't have machines calibrated correctly. And, oh, by the way, greatest generation, I will subscribe to that moniker, but there's some strikes going on, labor strife, where guys don't want to work. And they're lazy, and they're not that good at what they're doing on the East Coast. And so what happens is they move a lot of the R3350 engines designs somewhere else and manufactured somewhere else. That's part of that story, too. Yes, sir?
How quickly we get an engine routine?
How come?
How quickly in the field?
Excuse me.
Yeah. Oh, okay, yeah. How long in the field does it take to change an engine? Depends upon the ground crew. A good ground crew will take anywhere from 4 to 6 hours to change out an engine. Here's something else. Every 24 hours of flight time, the engine needs to be replaced. It's not a lot of time. So these ground crew, again, this is the logistics piece. When you think air power, it's a system. It's just not planes, air crewmen, and pilots. It's the guy that is changing these engines out, that's making that apron, that's creating the engine or the hangar bays, the guys in the tower that are doing air traffic control. It's a system. And if any one of those systems breaks down, those airplanes aren't flying. We don't give enough credit to the ground crewmen. Those guys go back to the Battle of Kansas, out there freezing their butts off in tar paper shacks, changing these engines out. They are the unsung heroes of American air power. And anyone who hears a pilot knows what I'm talking about. Yes, sir.
Where was the Enola Gay assembled?
She was built up in Omaha at the Marietta plant up there, and the gentleman says he visited. You can still go to that building. It's on Offutt Air Force Base. It's called Building D. It's a huge structure, and what they've actually done, it's still there. They've built buildings within the building, so they still use it, but not to build airplanes anymore. And you can purchase, they have the wooden brick floors that where you can purchase those as a memento from there. My father used to work there as an Air Force officer, so again, it's still there and it's on the high ground. You can't miss it if you go to Offutt Air Force Base. Yes, sir. Oh, I'll get you in a second.
Problems with espionage, they're out in the open.
Yeah, good question. With the B-29, during the development, I am not aware of any, but But let me caveat that. During the combined bomber offensive in the Pacific, 4 B-29s have engine failure or mechanical failure, and they divert to the Soviet Union. Now, before August of 1945, the Soviets aren't at war in the Pacific. The Japanese are deathly afraid of them, but they're not at war. And of course, the Soviets are our allies, okay, right? But it's a shotgun wedding, okay? But what happens is these planes are flown to the Soviet Union. The crews are impounded, as are the aircraft. Now, here comes the rest of the story. What the Russians do is they take those B-29s, reverse engineer them, and next thing you know, they have what's called the Tu-4 Bull, which is a carbon copy of the American B-29, and it is their first true strategic bomber. Now, here's a great story for you. I haven't been able to verify this, but it makes for a good story, so I'll tell it to you anyway. Supposedly, one of the B-29s that was impounded had some flak damage from a previous mission. And so like a good air crewman or a ground crewman, he patches it up because there's a hole there. Well, the Russians will only do a carbon copy. So what did they do? Put a patch there because that's what's on the American one. All right. Incidentally, Hap-Arnold will sign off on one of the B-29s during the Battle of Kansas, and it'll be called the Hap-Arnold Special because he wrote his name on it. That's one of the planes that goes to Russia that gets captured, the Hap-Arnold Special. Yes, sir. You have a question for me or statement?
You list the major cities that were being destroyed. You didn't list Kyushu because we were told never to bomb the sacred city.
Yes.
And it was the twin city of Osaka on one side, like Minneapolis and St. Paul.
Yes.
And anyway, that wasn't necessarily a big humane move. It was just practical.
Yeah. You want to repeat just to summarize again real short? I don't think everybody in the back heard you.
Repeat it.
Go ahead and repeat it.
We
sir.
didn't bomb Kyushu because it was considered a sacred city, and it was the sister or twin city of Osaka, which was greatly destroyed.
Yeah. One of the things that you have going on during this war is as much as the Japanese are hated and vilified, and the Pacific War is a race war at its very core. We hate them, they hate us. End of story, okay? However, many strategic planners with deep thinking guys like George Marshall will realize this war is going to be over someday. And with the emergence of the Soviet Union, we're going to need them as an ally. So even though they're terrible, you know, I'll use the vernacular of the term, slopes, rats, monkeys, whatever term, disparaging term we used at the time, we still have to be respectful because we're going to need them later on. And as the gentleman just said, there are targets that will be off limits, not only from a cultural perspective, but Hiroshima and Nagasaki are off limits. Why? Because we want a clean target. We want to measure the effects of this thing. And so I want to hit a city that hasn't been bombed yet so we can really figure out what's the blast radius, what's the effect of these things. And those two targets are there is a list of 5 cities that will not be bombed so we can measure the effects cleanly from the atomic bomb. One of them is Kyoto, who is the traditional, not Tokyo, Kyoto is the traditional home of the shogunate and the emperor. That is removed. And how it gets removed is that Secretary Stimson, Secretary of War, was the ambassador to the Philippines, and he knows of the importance of Kyoto to the Japanese people. And he walks into Truman's office. He goes to Truman and says, take it off the list. And that's how it gets removed. And it gets replaced with Hiroshima. So there you go.
Keep asking questions, but let me get to you with the microphone so everyone can hear.
Yeah. I saw a hand up. Yes, so the gentleman right here.
I was in high school and lived at Dwight, which is about 60 miles west, between Salina and the bombing range.
Okay, yeah.
And one morning, B-29 they bailed out. 10 guys bailed out of B-29. The navigator thought he was going to hit our house because their parachutes they set in them then, and so
Yeah.
anyway, but it was quite a thing. The other thing, a mile south of Dwight and a little bit east, we could see 30 miles down to the Harrington Air Base, and some mornings you could see the propellers from the B-29s warming up on the pier.
Yeah, much of Kansas is used for a bombing range or practice range, and so what you'll see, the gentleman, as he was articulating, was if you were in Kansas at the time, you saw B-29s almost every day flying all over Kansas, because this was the major training ground for the air crews before they went overseas. Another gentleman came up to me before the break and talked about how crews would fly from Kansas down to the Caribbean. So 1,500 miles. It's the same distance from, say, Chengdu is to Kyushu, or from the Marianas up to Tokyo, to kind of get the idea of what it's like to fly and to navigate that distance. Remember, this is the days before TACAN, VORs, radar navigation. The navigators are DR in this stuff, direct navigation, time, wind, distance, speed, those kinds of things. So you can think how difficult it was flying over an ocean, okay, and trying to navigate this stuff. Yes, sir.
I just have an engine question. Was the engine in the B-29 that powered it, is that the same engine we had in the C-119 and the KC-97?
KC-97, yes. No? Go ahead, sir.
There was a 2950.
1997 had a bigger engine, 4360.
Okay.
2,200 right.
2,200 horsepower. It was the same engine that they used in Constellations and in Sky Raiders, the AD-1 Sky Raiders. By the time the 1950s rolls around, it's becoming a legacy engine, but they get a lot of the bugs worked out of it, and it becomes somewhat of a reliable engine. But by 44 and 45, it's still here's a great quote from Curtis LeMay, and I'm going to quote it to you. The B-29 has as many bugs as the entomological department at the Smithsonian. Every time we licked a bug, other ones crawled out from underneath the cowling. That's a quote from Kurt LeMay about the B-29 engine, sir. Yeah. Yes, sir, back there. I'm sorry, I can't hear you, sir.
My dad went through. My dad went through all that out there, Salina and all that. He was telling some of the tales of what they went through with the winter. And
I am not familiar with that, but I tell you, this gentleman probably is. The gentleman's asking about the training that they went through here in Salina and these areas. Is this where you trained as well, sir?
Yeah, the training bases were Great Bend.
Get to the microphone here, sir, so we can. Yeah, hold on a second.
Anyway.
It's good that I need my exercise.
Great Bend, Pratt, and, the training bases for the 73rd Bomb Wing were at Salina, Great Bend, Pratt, and Walker, which is outside of Hayes. And I trained very little because I was a substitute radio operator, and I was waiting for the next crew, but my crew, under Major Anderson, they had finished their training, and the radio operator was going to his home in Nebraska. He was in a wreck, and guess who got to replace him? And so I did fly to Cuba and back with the coach, and to Galveston and back. So my training was kind of short-lived. We picked up a new plane at Harrington, flew from Harrington to California to George Rogers Field of Hawaiian Islands to Kwajalein to Saipan. So that's my journey.
Yeah. And with no iPod to listen to music on the way there and back, right? Yes, sir, right here.
How many of the aircraft are still flying?
Two. They have Doc that they just rebuilt in Wichita, and then, of course, there's Fifi, which is the commemorative Air Force B-29, and she needed a wing spar repair, I think, last year or 2 years ago. I think she's back up. Correct me if I'm wrong, if somebody is more up to date, but there's two flying around, and you can pay the money to go fly in one. Here's the deal, folks. It depends on where you sit, how much money you're paying. If you're going to sit in the greenhouse, I think it's over $1,000. If you're going to sit in the back, it's a few $100. But here's the good news. It's tax deductible. You know how I know that? Because I've flown with those guys. It's tax deductible, so there you go. Okay. Does that answer your question, sir?
What was the max altitude versus the Japanese fighters?
Yeah, good question. The B-29 can fly around 30,000 feet during this time. Ballpark, I don't know the actual figure, but that's about where it is. Japanese fighters, here's the problem the Japanese fighters have. The Japanese built very light aircraft compared to the Americans. Very light aircraft and don't have turbochargers and superchargers like we do in ours, which is why we're so effective at higher altitudes, because our engines are bigger, more powerful, and they have turbochargers. The Japanese don't have that. So at altitude, they're not comparable to, say, American fighters. And one thing that does start to happen when the Marines take Iwo Jima again, you're welcome, we're going to put a P-51 base right there to escort the B-29s, because up until that point, they're kind of on their own. Now the P-51s will fly with the B-29s.
Although they're back.
All the way there and back. And actually what will happen is the P-51s need the B-29s to navigate for them because they're single seat. They need a navigator to kind of help them navigate all the way over the Pacific. And once you have the P-51s with their Merlin engines and great performance, the game is over for the Japanese. So the Japanese don't have aircraft that can match the performance of the American ones at altitude. And plus the Japanese aircraft don't have armor plating, self-sealing tanks, all those things that we built into our aircraft for safety purposes and for crew protection. Does that answer your question, sir?
Yeah. When they discovered the danger of firebombing, did they do the attack runs at maneuvering speed or not?
At what?
Maneuvering speed? So do they eliminate the
it depends. It depends on which mission, what kind of mission they are flying. Okay, here's why I say this. It's because you have the jet stream to deal with, but you're at low altitudes. They did both bombing, regular bombing and firebombing. There's mixtures of both. Okay, so it depends on which type of bombing you're doing. For the area bombing at lower altitudes, cruise speed was usually around 250, because if you start getting higher in those airspeeds, it's harder for the navigator to set the Norden bomb sight and the intervalometer and those kinds of things, because you're at lower altitudes. So you have to fly slower to give the guide some time to sight the target. At higher altitudes, okay, it's a different story. Here's one of the problems you have at higher altitude. Because the jet stream is up there, the bomb drift is so powerful that the Norden bomb sight can't compensate for that much drift. That's one other reason we have to go lower, because the prevailing winds will throw off your targeting.
I think I've seen at least 3 hands. Let's get those 3 questions in.
How high did they fly from the atomic bomb?
Oh, gee, that's a good question. They drop it, I think it's around 10,000 feet, and the bomb explodes at 1,500. It's an airburst. And the reason why I say it is because one of the things that the B-29 has to do, and these are the specially modified silver plate aircraft, what happens is the B-29 has to drop the bomb and then do a 180-degree turn, dropping 3,000 feet in altitude to egress the target area, to get out of the way. And so they're flying right around 10,000 to drop the bomb, which will explode at 1,500. And it gives them, I think, about a minute, if I remember correctly, to get out. The crew of the Enola Gay feel 2 shock waves, one from the initial blast, and then there's an echo wave that bounces off the ground, and it hits the bomber again, so they get jolted twice from the blast itself. Does that answer your question, sir? Okay. Yes, sir.
Yeah, you had mentioned Doc and Fifi.
Yes.
They were both a great band this past September.
Okay. Yeah.
They both are flying, and there is a new hangar in Wichita.
Wonderful.
So that's all been completed as well.
Super. Thank you for that update. And I know every now and then the Commemorative Air Force out in Kansas City, she'll fly in routinely and do rides there, usually around the September timeframe if you're interested in jumping on one of those. Yes, sir.
Let's make this the last question.
And I'll stay around if you have questions after we're done. I'm not going anywhere.
What was the survival rate of the airframes through the war?
Of the entire B-29 fleet, I think they lose about a quarter of them. Most of it not from combat. Most of it for the reasons I stated. It's not combat, it's running out of fuel, engines overturning or burning up, catastrophic failure of the aircraft. It is not from combat. It's about 20%, if I remember correctly. Okay.
Can I point out one thing?
Yes, sir, go right ahead, please.
On the B-29, they had a terrible problem. Here in Kansas, it was cold. Down the South Pacific, it was very hot. And they figured out they were putting the fuel that was going into
That
planes.
was supposed to be the last question.
And therefore, the engines didn't run. And so that's a problem they had to work over, and that's why they lost a lot of
The planes, yeah. Yeah, it was, again, a lot of it is just operational loss, not combat, but just operational loss on this. And one of the things I told you, too, was this idea that the plane overheats even on the ground. And you think about this, if you want to launch a 100-plane raid and the planes overheat within 10 engines or 10 minutes, you got to get these planes off the ground and get those cooling fins cooled really quick. And so again, there's a choreography that goes on to launch these aircraft. And to me, it goes back to what I said at the very beginning of this. The gentlemen that flew these aircraft are truly our heroes in my eyes, and they should be, in everybody else's eyes here too, because not only fighting the Japanese in an environment that their humans don't belong in, but fighting the aircraft too, an aircraft that was trying to kill them to a certain extent. Yeah.
As John said, he will be happy to take any further questions after the talk. For right now, however, let's give him a great round of applause.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight.